Well, good morning, brothers and sisters at Grace Bible Chapel. We're on to another week, and this week I just want to do something a little bit different. I want to look into the Old Testament, and I want to actually look at the law. I want to look at the Ten Commandments and just take a few things out of there that we can learn. And so we're going to go back to the book of Deuteronomy. Now, this is actually one of my favorite books in the Bible in a lot of ways. And I know as a younger person I wouldn't have been able to say that, but when we look at Deuteronomy and see what it actually is this is Moses' final sermon to the people of Israel, his final words to them before they're about to enter into the promised land. And Moses isn't going to go with him. God has told him that. And that he actually dies at 120 years old before the nation of Israel enters into the promised land. And it's Joshua who is the one who leads them in. And these are his final words to the nation. And in there, he recounts a lot of things that have happened to them. And just sort of understanding a bit of the backstory here, they had wandered around the desert for 40 years because the first time they had come to Kadesh Barnea, and they had sent in the 12 spies, and 2 came back with a good report. That was Joshua and Caleb saying it is a wonderful land and God has given it to us. And 10 came back and said, yeah, but there's these big cities, they got high walls, there's giants. If we go in there, we're going to be wiped out. And because of their unbelief, they sided with the 10 spies who had a bad report. And because they said, well, let's just go back to Egypt. And they didn't believe God and the promise that he had made them, in spite of all of the things that he had done for them and all that they had seen about him. He told them that they were going to wander around the desert for 40 years. And in that time, that generation that didn't believe God's promises would die off, and it would be their children who they thought would be killed in the process of trying to take the land. That it was their children who would rise up and would be the generation that goes into the promised land. And so these are Moses' words to these people, to this younger generation. And so he's reminding them all of the things that the nation has gone through. And at this point in chapter 5, he recounts to them the events that happened at Mount Horeb, where God himself spoke to the people from the fire and the storm and the cloud that was on the mountain, and he gave them the law, the 10 Commandments, or what we know them as. And there's so much that we can learn from the 10 Commandments, from the law. You know, sometimes we may think that when Jesus Christ came and died for our sins that he abolished the law. That's not what happened. In fact, he even said that himself, that he wasn't abolishing the law, but he came to fulfill it. You see, the law is actually very, very important. It shows us a lot about who God is. It speaks to his heart and what's important to him. And so we need to know what is in the law so that we can love him better and serve him better. But it does something else as well. Now, the Apostle Paul would describe the law as our tutor and our teacher. In other words, it tells us a lot about ourselves as well. James would write about the law and the Word of God, and he would describe it as a mirror, that you look into it and you see what you are really like. You see that you don't meet this standard that God has given. And he describes it as the law of liberty, which is, you would think that this would be a strange way. You wouldn't think liberty and law would go together. And yet James says they do. It's the perfect law. It's the law of liberty. When we see ourselves for what we're really like before God, it's actually freeing to us. You know, we've touched on this a little bit last week when we talked about forgiveness and how David would write about forgiveness, saying, when I kept my sin, when I hid my sin, it was a weight on me. But when I confessed it to you, speaking to the Lord, while it was freedom, he found forgiveness. You know, and it's the same for us. When we look at the law, we're not to take the law, you know, and we, you know, when you see yourself in a mirror and you see your face is dirty in a mirror, you don't take the mirror and try and clean your face. That's not its purpose. but it shows us what we're really like. It shows us the things that God needs to work on and change in our own heart. And so it's very, very important. It also tells us again what's important to him. So we're just going to read the introduction that is in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy. And here Moses again, he retells the story of what happened. And we're just going to look at the very first of the 10 Commandments. So I think it's probably, if not the most important, one of the most important commandments that's given. So let's take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 5. In verse 1 it says this, "And Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. And the Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire. While I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up into the mountain. And he said, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." And this is the first commandment. This is just such an amazing story. I'm always fascinated by this story because God actually speaks audibly to the people, and it terrifies them. And they go to Moses and they say, "Look, don't let God speak to us again because we can't handle it. You go and speak to him and then tell us." And this was a good, positive response to the holiness of God. That they could see how powerful and mighty he is and how they don't measure up to him. And here God speaks to them the law, the 10 Commandments. And this is the very first one. You shall have no other God before me. This is, you would think that this would be easy for the Israelites. They had witnessed what God had done. They had witnessed that with the power and might that he had delivered them out of Egypt. They had been provided for by him throughout the desert where he fed them every day. He was with them the whole time as a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day, and he led them through the desert. And time again, his power was on display to them. A power like none of the other gods of the nations around. You think this would have been the easiest thing for them? Just to say, we know that God's real, we've seen the evidence of it. What else would we want? And yet so often they fell into this sin of idolatry. And that's really what it is whenever whenever the nation would put another God and worship another God, now that was an idol, that was idolatry. And that ties into the second commandment that God gives, that they were not to have any graven image. In fact, let's read that. It says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." You see, we need to worship God alone. And this applies to us again today as well. We might not think so. We think, well, we don't have like a little statue that we worship, or we don't have an image that we bow down to. And we don't have other gods. And yet the Apostle Paul, when he writes to the Colossians, he says something very interesting in chapter 3 about this sin of idolatry. And it puts it in a perspective that really hits home. And I remember reading this and it just sinking in the very first time that I noticed it. And it was like an arrow between the eyes in so many ways. So let's take a look at this in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. And it says this, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passions, evil desires, and covetousness, which is idolatry." To covet. to want something. That's idolatry. You know, and that idea of covet is almost, it's like a longing for, it's like a deep desire for. It's not just like a, oh, that would be nice to have. It's like, no, I really want this. Like, you know, you could think of when you're younger, you might have had a dream car, or you might have this goal or a job or something, and you just like, that's what you wanted more than anything. That's to covet something. You know, or maybe you wanted a position, or you wanted to be more popular in school, or whatever it is. And that's not just in our past, we see that today, don't we, in our own lives, if we're honest. The things that we covet. Well, Paul tells us that that's idolatry. Anything that we desire more than God, anything that we want more than Him, anything that we put ahead of Him is idolatry. And it breaks the very first commandment that God gives. Now again, when we see that, the purpose of that is not to beat it over our heads and to make us feel guilty and bad and horrible for it. That's not what its purpose is. The law is a tutor. It's to teach us. We're to see that in ourselves and say, okay, this is an area that I need to change. God, I need you to work in my heart here. You know, when we see it, it's like a mirror. It's like showing ourselves, this is what I'm really like. And then we go to the Father and we say, Father, help me to change this. I see this sin in my heart. I see this attitude that's wrong. I need your help to work in me and to change it. And those honest conversations with God is what we need. It's what He desires. It's what He wants from us and for us. You know, and so as for this week, we touch on, we're not going to go through all of the commandments, but we'll take a look at some of them. And the idea here is this, is to see the law as our tutor and to learn from it. And to learn the practice of taking a look at our own heart, that self-reflection, and having honest conversations before God about where we stand in our heart, so that we can allow Him to work in us, to change us, to conform us to the image of His Son, as Paul would write in Romans. God bless this morning, and have a great day.